One of the most common examples of conditional relevance also comes up in another provision that we'll study later, which is called authentication. So an example of authentication slash conditional relevance is that we want to introduce a letter, we want to introduce a videotape, we want to introduce something that depends on its authenticity, that it was written by the person we say it was written by, that the person on the videotape is the person we claim it to be. But you can't do that all at once. Obviously, as we talked about with other examples of conditional relevance, when one thing depends on another, you cannot simultaneously introduce 5 pieces of evidence. So you have to introduce one that supports the other. And of course, under Rule 104B, you're absolutely allowed to do this. So we look at this example of State versus Thompson. It's just a very, very easy case that lays out this kind of foundational proposition for the idea that you're allowed to do this. So we go back to our charta course map and we pull up conditional relevance, which is where we are, and we go to the case of State versus Thompson. Now, in State versus Thompson, the prosecution in this case is trying to get in some emails that a wife sent to her husband that were indicative of her intent to physically abuse him. So obviously not a nice case, but as lawyers, you're going to have a whole lot of examples like that. But the question in this case of the Thompson case is, how do we go about establishing that the email actually came from the wife, and that the thing that we claim is her text actually is her text? Well, as you'll see in this case, the court says that the husband's identification of her unique signature line and the fact that the text came in with an FR:"Jen," which he had pre-programmed to do, his phone to do, to set up that way to receive messages from his wife, that's sufficient authentication for the jury to hear the evidence. Does that mean that the jury can't conclude that it's someone else's text? No, absolutely. And does that mean that the defense lawyers can't argue that this was not from her phone or that someone else had her phone? Absolutely not. All we're looking at when we're talking about all the rules of evidence is admissibility. Does the jury get to hear this particular piece of evidence? And for authentication, which we'll come back to when we look at Rule 901, we're talking about it here because that's a special subset of conditional relevance. We only care about the text message, the videotape, the handwritten note, if in fact it is what we say it is. Much like the testimony of the jailhouse informant in the McNeely case that we looked at last time. Here, we're looking at a text message that only has relevance if it came from the person we say it came from. It is enough to get that information before the jury if you can show there are certain telltale signs about this text message, in this case, the signature line and the way that his phone organized it into the defendant's, not the defendant, into the defendant's husband's phone. And this is being a domestic violence question. It was the wife in this case who was the abuser. Allegedly, actually, absolutely, because she was convicted of the crime. But the key thing to take away from this case is that you have to authenticate something by offering evidence that it is in fact what you say it is as the proponent of that evidence. So if you say this is a text message from Jen, you have to show something that connects Jen with this particular text message, with the phone number, with the signature line, with something that shows that this was in fact from Jen's phone, and then that evidence will go to the jury. There are very specific ways of authenticating things like emails, and videotapes are becoming increasingly complicated because of the ability to falsify this sort of evidence. But as you get into practice, you'll look specifically at very complicated digital evidence. It's enough to know right now that what you have to do is establish something that shows that this is what it says it is. And we'll get into more specifics when we get to Rule 901 and the specific provision on authentication.